Following President Trump's return to the White House, the once unbreakable bonds between the United States and its long-standing allies began to fray. A shadow of estrangement loomed on the horizon, and the world held its breath, watching the unfolding drama. Would this political rift alter the global order forever? Take, for example, the unprecedented tensions that arose between the U.S. and Canada, triggered by Trump's audacious call to annex its northern neighbor as the 51st state. What began as a contentious remark escalated into a full-blown diplomatic crisis, spawning a cascade of tariffs, trade embargoes, and public disputes that cast a pall over the long-standing partnership between the two neighboring countries. Similarly, relations between the United States and the European Union, two powers that have historically stood together as close allies, faced severe upheaval. From the early days of his new term, Trump repeatedly accused the EU of taking advantage of the United States through unfair trade practices and one-sided defense agreements. He argued that the U.S. bore the cost of protecting Europe without adequate contributions from EU member states, fueling a narrative of imbalance and exploitation. Disagreements in rhetoric swiftly transitioned to the political arena, exposing a deep divide between the United States and the European Union in their approaches to addressing global challenges. This was most evident in their strategies for supporting Ukraine. Despite initially demonstrating unity by coordinating their response to Russian aggression, gradually escalating contradictions pushed them towards increasingly independent paths. This, in turn, began to erode the unity that was once the cornerstone of the transatlantic alliance. Tensions reached a boiling point after the Trump administration's decision to impose 20% tariffs on goods imported from EU countries. While the White House presented this move as a fair response to perceived trade imbalances, it only poured fuel on the fire, further complicating already strained relations. In response, the European Union is developing its own countermeasures, which appear to be broader in scope than traditional trade tariffs. This time, the EU intends to strike at the most vulnerable point of the American economy: large technology companies. Given that the European market is one of the largest in the world for giants like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Meta, the EU has significant leverage to force Washington to reconsider its policies. European companies derive tremendous profits from the region, and any pressure, whether regulatory or financial, could seriously affect their global operations. Unlike the United States, which lacks European tech giants of comparable scale, the EU's actions in this area are strategically aimed at striking the most vulnerable points without fear of equal retaliation. Let's delve into the details of this EU move, a response that marks a distinct departure from traditional trade retaliation measures towards a more strategic and risky confrontation with American tech corporations. In response to this aggressive trade war, French Finance Minister Eric Lombard outlined countermeasures, suggesting that the EU could refocus its attention on American technology companies by tightening data handling rules. This approach would allow the European Union to exert economic pressure without unleashing a full-scale trade war, preserving space for negotiation and protecting its economic interests. At the heart of this strategy lies the desire to curb the power of American technology corporations in the realm of data. France sees existing mechanisms such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, as a reliable tool. GDPR has tightened the rules of the game in the field of information collection and processing, having a noticeable impact on the global business environment. But the Europeans are not stopping there. In the future, new legislative initiatives are planned, such as the EU Data Act. This law could require multinational corporations like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft to share valuable data with their European competitors. Another blow to their business models is possible restrictions on the transfer of industrial data across borders. Such measures could seriously change the rules of the game for American tech giants operating in the European Union. They will have to bear additional costs to comply with the new requirements and possibly revise their data management strategies. In addition to regulatory pressure, France is advocating for a digital services tax targeting the largest American technology companies, known by the acronym GAFAM: Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. The initiative, aimed at restoring economic fairness, could find support from Germany and other influential members of the European community who share a desire for equitable economic exchange. The proposed taxation measures are likely to affect areas such as app stores, cloud services, and the smartphone market, where American corporations hold dominant positions in the European arena. This targeted financial strike is intended not only to balance transatlantic trade but also to stimulate fair competition in the digital economy of the European Union. Beyond the digital sphere, the EU is considering other economic levers. In particular, there is discussion of tightening environmental standards or introducing selective restrictions in industry instead of applying comprehensive tariff measures. This approach will allow the European Union to focus its response on specific sectors where the United States has a significant trade advantage, such as technology and services. This, in turn, will increase the strategic effectiveness of the measures without unduly harming its own sectors of the European economy. During lively discussions, European Union representatives have repeatedly emphasized the need for proportionate and reversible measures aimed at stimulating dialogue rather than escalating tensions. As part of this balanced approach, the EU reserves the right to deploy coercion countermeasures, potentially restricting United States access to European public procurement or imposing restrictions on intellectual property rights within the bloc. These instruments reflect the EU's broader goal of strengthening its regulatory leadership, especially in the rapidly evolving digital and information spheres. Naturally, the question arises about the financial interests of the largest technology companies in the European market. Indeed, leading American tech giants such as Meta, Google, Apple, and Amazon remain heavily reliant on the European market as a key driver of their global revenue growth. Meta Platforms, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, generated an impressive $38.36 billion in revenue from Europe in fiscal year 2024. This figure represents 23.32% of the company's total global revenue, highlighting the significance of the European market to its financial well-being. The European market demonstrates impressive resilience and profitability for tech giants, despite regulatory pressures. Meta's revenue in Europe reached $37.64 billion in 2024, a clear demonstration of growth of more than 20% compared to the $31.21 billion recorded a year earlier. And while the European market's share of Meta's overall revenue structure has declined somewhat from 25% in 2017, the region remains the company's second-largest market after North America. It is noteworthy that this growth dynamic is observed against the backdrop of tightening European legislation, in particular under the close scrutiny of the Digital Markets Act, which could entail large fines for Meta. A similar picture is observed at Google, whose revenues in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region exceeded the $100 billion mark for the first time in 2024. The lion's share of Google's European revenue comes from search advertising, which remains a key source of profit and accounts for more than half of the company's global advertising revenue. The contribution of YouTube, whose popularity in European markets continues to grow, providing a steady stream of advertising revenue, should not be underestimated. The figures show the deep penetration of Google's services into the fabric of everyday life and commerce in the European Union. Apple is also not left out, demonstrating impressive financial results in the region. In fiscal year 2024, the company reported revenue from Europe of $101.3 billion, surpassing the previous year's figure of $94.2 billion. The European market accounts for approximately 26% of Apple's global revenue, second only to the Americas in terms of significance. Apple's operating profit in Europe reached a record $42 billion in 2024, significantly higher than the $36 billion in 2023. These figures reflect strong European consumer demand for a wide range of Apple products, from iPhones and MacBooks to services such as iCloud and Apple Music. Amazon's figures are somewhat more difficult to interpret as the company includes European sales in a broader international segment. Nevertheless, Amazon's international sales reached $43.4 billion in the fourth quarter of 2024 alone, representing a 9% year-over-year increase. Although Amazon does not provide a breakdown of revenues by European countries, available information suggests that Europe continues to play an important role in the company's global growth. This is driven by large-scale investments in logistics infrastructure and the expansion of prime services across the European continent. Analysts predict further strengthening of Amazon's position in Europe. Overall, the financial performance indicates the key role of the European Union in the financial systems of American tech giants. The European market not only provides them with a vast and solvent customer base but also serves as an indicator of global trends in regulation. As the European Union strives for digital sovereignty and tightens legislation on data and competition, these companies increasingly face the need to adapt their operations. However, the immense revenues they generate in Europe make a market exit unlikely. The future development of relations between Silicon Valley and Brussels will likely be determined by ongoing dialogue between policymakers and corporate leaders. The European Union firmly holds its position as an influential economic partner and trendsetter for the American tech industry. The steady growth in financial performance of giants like Meta, Google, Apple, and Amazon serves as compelling evidence that, despite political disagreements and regulatory battles, the European market remains vital for American tech companies. Let's delve into the details of trade relations between the EU and the US to understand whether the European side has indeed imposed any tariffs on American products. The European Union and the United States of America are cornerstones of the world's largest bilateral trade relationship, with a combined volume reaching an impressive €1.6 trillion in 2023. Of this amount, €851 billion is attributed to trade in goods and €746 billion to services. Strong transatlantic ties reflect deeply integrated economic interests that have been shaped by decades of mutual investment and coordinated regulation. Trade in goods demonstrates impressive scale. The European Union sent goods worth €453 billion to the United States, representing 20.6% of total EU exports. Imports from the US reached €347 billion, resulting in a significant trade surplus of €157 billion in favor of the European side. The structure of exports is dominated by industries such as machinery and transport equipment, accounting for 39% of deliveries, the chemical industry with a share of 32%, and other manufactured goods, comprising 20%. However, when it comes to services, the picture changes. In 2023, the EU imported services from the US worth €427 billion, while exports of services from the EU to the US amounted to €319 billion, resulting in a deficit of €19 billion. In addition to trade flows, the transatlantic economic space is characterized by large-scale investment. Mutual foreign direct investment reaches €5.3 trillion, supporting millions of jobs in both Europe and the United States, and further strengthening the economic interconnectedness between the two continents. On April 2, 2025, a storm of indignation erupted when the administration of President Donald Trump in the U.S. announced the imposition of 20% tariffs on goods coming from the European Union. The justification for such a drastic step was the claim that it was an adequate response to what Trump called a de facto 39% tariff allegedly imposed by the EU on American goods. However, this assertion immediately triggered a wave of criticism and refutation from European officials and international trade experts. The facts told a different story. The average tariff levied by the EU on goods from the US was significantly lower. According to estimates by the European Commission, it was about 1%, and according to the World Trade Organization, 4.8%. Moreover, statistics showed that in 2023, the US collected an impressive €7 billion in duties on imports from the EU, more than double the €3 billion collected by the EU on American goods. As for the controversial figure of 39% voiced by Trump, it arose from a rather peculiar calculation. The U.S. trade deficit with the EU of €198.2 billion was simply divided by the volume of EU exports to the U.S., amounting to €531.6 billion. Economists unanimously rejected this approach, calling it an unconventional and misleading method of assessing trade policy. In response to the United States' protectionist measures, the European Union is developing a carefully calibrated, multi-stage containment strategy aimed at protecting its own economic interests and preventing the escalation of tensions into a full-blown trade war. A key element of this strategy will be the introduction of targeted retaliatory tariffs on American goods totaling €26 billion. It is anticipated that key sectors such as the steel industry, agriculture, and mechanical engineering will be affected. These measures are expected to take effect in mid-April. Notably, the EU may choose to target industries concentrated in states traditionally supporting the Republican Party or businesses closely linked to Donald Trump's political base. The calculation here is simple: to exert economic pressure to trigger a political reaction directly within the United States. In addition to tariff measures, the European Union is considering the use of regulatory and fiscal instruments that could significantly affect the interests of major American technology corporations. This includes tightening controls on compliance with personal data protection rules such as the General Data Protection Regulation (GDPR), as well as potential restrictions under the European Data Act, creating new challenges for American IT giants in the European market. Behind the scenes of European politics, debates continue about the introduction or expansion of digital services taxation targeting multinational corporations like Google, Amazon, and Meta. Notably, the European revenue of these giants accounts for a significant share, from 20% to 26% of their global income. The European Union also has another instrument in its arsenal, the anti-coercion mechanism. This allows it to restrict American companies' access to lucrative EU public procurement contracts, financial markets, and intellectual property rights. This mechanism is designed to counter economic pressure from third countries, giving the EU the ability to exert influence without resorting solely to tariffs. Although these measures are still under discussion, their coordinated application could fundamentally alter the transatlantic trade landscape. The economic consequences of this tariff confrontation are already being felt. According to estimates by the European Central Bank, in the event of an escalation of tariff wars, the Eurozone's GDP growth could slow by 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points. Analysts at Frontier Economics predict a significant reduction in export revenues for European manufacturers. The introduction of 20% duties could result in a loss of up to $29 billion for the European Union. However, the United States will not be able to avoid negative consequences either. Retaliatory 25% tariffs on goods from the EU threaten the American economy with a decrease in overall welfare of approximately 1.5%. Such a move would inevitably lead to a sharp reduction in transatlantic trade, which would painfully affect many sectors. The automotive industry is particularly vulnerable. About 21% of European car exports go to the American market, and 15% of cars manufactured in the United States are shipped to Europe. Notably, American pickup trucks are already subject to a 25% duty in the EU, while European cars imported into the United States are subject to a tariff of only 10%. This imbalance creates tension that could intensify with the introduction of new duties. In the field of high technology, stricter data processing rules could significantly increase the costs of American companies associated with the need to comply with new requirements. The transatlantic confrontation, going beyond dry economic calculations, is fraught with tectonic shifts in the global economy and geopolitical architecture. Stock indices on both sides of the Atlantic are already showing feverish volatility, reflecting the depth of investors' anxiety in the face of the specter of trade war-induced stagflation. Analysts predict that Washington's protectionist measures could turn into an unexpected benefit for Chinese exports, redirecting trade flows and exacerbating competition for European manufacturers. This could disrupt the fragile balance that Europe is trying to maintain, maneuvering between economic interests and strategic independence in relations with the United States and China. Despite the escalating tensions, Brussels demonstrates a willingness to engage in dialogue, striving for a balanced agreement that takes mutual interests into account in order to avoid a protracted economic war. However, European officials make it clear that they are ready to retaliate in the event of failed negotiations. In the grimmest scenario where tariff battles escalate into a full-blown conflict, global economic losses could reach an astronomical $1.4 trillion, according to the latest projections. Amid unfolding events in global trade, the tariff war initiated by the Trump administration against allied countries is creating a spectrum of serious challenges and long-term consequences. Economically, both the United States and its partners, including the European Union and Canada, are at risk of destabilization. Rising consumer prices, increased inflation, and reduced trade volumes could hit various sectors of the economy on both sides of the Atlantic, slowing economic growth and burdening family budgets. However, the consequences of tariff disputes are not limited to the economy. Political and strategic shifts could radically transform the global order. Traditional alliances are experiencing unprecedented strain, and organizations like NATO are reportedly discussing structural reforms in response to the deepening divide between the US and its allies. Undermining trust creates a danger of further geopolitical destabilization as coordination in defense, security, and foreign policy becomes increasingly difficult. Tariff measures introduced by the United States under President Trump have provoked noticeable changes in relations with its closest trading partners, especially Canada and the European Union. Protectionist measures conceived as a tool to put pressure on foreign economies have turned into an unexpected stimulus for U.S. allies. Realizing the fragility of the former system has forced them to consider strengthening their own economic sovereignty and resilience. Canada and the countries of the European Union, learning from the situation, have begun to take concrete steps to reduce dependence on American markets and logistics chains. In the long term, these efforts could lead to strengthening their industrial potential and increasing competitiveness on the world stage. The Canadian government's reaction has been strategically calibrated and forward-looking. Noting the vulnerability arising from trade tensions, Ottawa has set a course to strengthen economic ties outside its southern neighbor. One of the key areas has been deepening trade relations with the European Union, supported by an impressive 65% growth in bilateral trade since 2017. The 2021 partnership, focused on the development and supply of critical raw materials, was another important step in this direction. Thus, Canada is consistently diversifying its export markets, seeking to reduce critical dependence on trade with the United States. Canada is betting on economic diversification, reinforcing it with renewed attention to the development of domestic production. Returning industrial capacity to the country and introducing advanced technologies such as robotics and artificial intelligence, the country seeks to breathe new life into key sectors, from clean energy to healthcare and transport. These investments not only strengthen economic sovereignty but also create a solid foundation for sustainable growth in the long term. An equally important area is strengthening the sovereignty of supply chains. Canada is consistently reducing its dependence on foreign suppliers, developing partnerships with local manufacturers, and modernizing national infrastructure. These efforts are aimed at protecting the Canadian economy from unpredictable global shocks and external political pressure, thereby creating a more stable and self-sufficient foundation for future prosperity. The European Union is pursuing similar goals, actively working to ensure reliable access to critical raw materials and reduce critical dependence on external suppliers. In an era of change, Europe seeks to strengthen its economic independence, and strategic partnerships with resource-rich countries such as Canada are of particular importance. Many European companies are revising their priorities in favor of reindustrialization, betting on long-term investments in national production rather than on immediate profit. This trend reflects growing concerns caused by geopolitical tensions, protectionist measures, and the vulnerability of global logistics chains. The situation is complicated by the changing global environment. Against the background of the transformation of Western alliances, some states are showing interest in new forms of cooperation in the East, including China, which has long been perceived as a strategic competitor. This reversal indicates a reassessment of global priorities and underscores the uncertainty of the current moment. The impact of the trade wars initiated by the Trump administration continues to affect the global economy. Will they lead to a reshaping of international alliances, a resurgence of national industrial complexes, or prolonged instability? The answer to this question will determine the trajectory of the world order in the coming years, when the stakes are higher than ever. In today's world, a new global order is forming, and this process deserves close attention. What will its appearance be? What forces determine its contours? This question worries many, and everyone can contribute to understanding what is happening by sharing their thoughts and observations. Today we have considered only some aspects of this complex topic. Thank you to everyone who was with us for your interest and participation. If you found the issues raised important and worthy of further study, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create new content and expand the circle of those who seek to understand the challenges of our time. And right now, we offer you another material that you may find no less interesting and informative.